Hey everyone, my name is Genevieve von Petzinger. I'm a paleoanthropologist and I study cave art from the Ice Age in Europe. So today I am going to answer some questions that I got from some elementary school kids in California. Specifically, they're from St. Helens Elementary School in Fresno, California. And their teacher's name is Ms. Noriego, and she teaches art, I believe, to some grade 3, 4, and 5s. Well, very kindly, she shared my research with them, and the kids had a whole bunch of really good questions. And honestly, they're actually questions I get asked by adults sometimes too. So I figured I might as well just record my response, and then it's good for the kids, and it also answers some questions for anybody else who's interested. So, without further ado, hi classes, thanks so much for sending me your questions, and let's see what I can do about answering them. So, number one is the grade threes wanted to know, were there saber-toothed tigers? Excellent question. Until recently, they actually thought saber-toothed tigers had gone extinct in Europe earlier. The ones there are actually called the scimitar cat. There's slightly different ones in different parts of the world. And so they thought they went extinct before modern humans showed up in Europe, like say around 300,000 years ago. But just a few years ago, they found a jawbone, which was only about 30,000 years ago, which came from a type of saber-toothed tiger that was in Europe. And so now it looks like maybe they were around. It's possible that just there wasn't very many of them left. And so that humans didn't really interact with them, or maybe they did. But what's so odd is that if they did interact with them, we would expect maybe either to see pictures of them on cave walls or to find their bones at the sites where people lived, because we found bones and seen pictures of all sorts of other things like cave lions and panthers and bears and all sorts of other sort of big scary animals, if you will. So we know they depicted them, and we know they sometimes killed them, but no evidence. So maybe there was just a few pockets left by then. But great question. Which also leads to questions you had about hunting and weapons. And so how did they hunt? Well, from what we know, I mean, obviously we're guessing because if there's no video, we can't go back. There's no time machine to see exactly how they did it. But based on what we can see, it looks like they had spears for pretty much the entire Stone Age time period. Our human ancestors always had spears. And it seems like they may have invented bows and arrows somewhere around 30, 40,000 years ago, though, again, there's been some new stuff in Africa which suggests maybe it was earlier, at least in certain places. So definitely, though, they had spears which would have had like a wooden shaft and a stone tip to them. And likely they either threw them at the animals, or they may have also sometimes almost thrusted them from closer up and sort of done it more like a stabbing motion. But definitely something in that realm was what was going on. And the question was, how could they find mammoths? Well, A, they're really big, and they travel in groups, so that makes it a bit easier to spot them. Second of all, I know there was some questions about what did it look like in Europe during the Ice Age, and the answer is that it was a little bit different than it was today. Back then, it would have looked more like the tundra, so what we think of now as being up in the Arctic. Large parts of Europe would have looked more like that, and things like trees would have been farther south. So a lot of the areas where people lived and painted caves and did things during the Ice Age were actually farther up into this area where it was an open, much more open space with big plains, maybe some grass, little stands of trees, but quite visible for long distances. So big things like mammoth probably would have been something they could spot. And of course, the people who lived back then were really good at tracking animals, and they probably knew some good spots to go to find them. What was their diet like? Well, of course, they ate meat. They ate mammoth, bison, horse, deer, ibex, so that's like a mountain goat, things like that. So they ate lots of different animals. Plants is harder because, of course, plants don't last so well in the archaeological record. And what I mean by that is plants, if you think about leaves in a forest floor, they really quickly decompose and go away, and the same thing happens. So we don't have a lot of evidence. But just in the last few years, there's been some good success with actually scraping tiny bits off of people's teeth from really old grave sites, and we've been able to get some ideas about what people might have been eating. And so it looks like they definitely did have some plants in their lives, and probably things like nuts and fruit, and maybe even some mushrooms and things like that. So probably more variety than we would realize. And then there was a question as well about how did they travel by foot in all that snow? Well, Our ancestors, being the inventive people that they were, once they were in an environment where it was cold and useful to have foot coverings, they invented shoes. And we can actually tell that they invented shoes somewhere, I think, around that 40-ish thousand mark. And certainly in Europe, what they start to see is that the bones in people's feet change when they have their feet covered up all the time. And so we actually start to see those changes that look more like our modern feet. So that it was a really good question. And that, yeah, we actually, thanks to the skeletons that we found, were able to answer some of those. Was there anything else? Why did they live in ice when they could move somewhere else? Well, first of all, the entire continent was a bit icy. Second of all, they were used to it. When they actually arrived, when humans first came into Europe around 45,000 years ago, it was actually a little bit of a warm spell comparatively. And so they would have come in and it probably seemed not too bad. And then just slowly but surely it would have gotten a little bit colder. But keep in mind, they were quite capable of wearing, nice big furry clothes. They had good techniques for hunting the animals that lived up there. And so even though to us it seems pretty cold, and terrible, I think they were quite used to it. And it was an environment that they knew what to do. And they were prepared for it. So yeah, I'm sure they had some chilly moments, but probably not quite as bad as, what we're thinking about with our nice, comfy, cozy houses. And we're not quite as well adapted to it anymore. The grade fives, we might as well answer questions just to do a sort of the environment and life back then, and then we'll get to some stuff that they had asked all the classes about what some of the signs might mean. So the grade fives wanted to know about adapting to the melt, I'm assuming at the end of the Ice Age, and how did that change their lives? Well, so the last glacial maximum, the glaciers came down to their maximum extent for the last time around 18,000 years ago. And then they started to recede. And this time when they went up, they actually kept going up, 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 until they got up to their present position, well, a little lower than what they are now, but what they were in recent times. And so what that would have done was it would have warmed Europe back up, for one thing, without it wouldn't have been so cold and icy. The other thing, of course, is it changed the levels of the water. So nowadays, there's all sorts of places in Europe that were along the coast that back then were above water and would have been nice places for them to live, which are now submerged in anywhere up to like 100 feet plus of water. So that definitely would have changed. They would have had to move where they were living because their villages would have gotten flooded. And then how did the food change? Well, again, they just would have had to adapt. And keep in mind that when we're looking at it, we're sort of seeing it as like, there was ice and then it all melted. But of course, it happened slowly. So they had time to get used to there being different animals around. There was more deer. There was more trees. Everything started to warm up, right? So the tundra started to go away. And how did they live after the ice melt? Well, it's interesting because after the ice melted, it wasn't very long. It was right in that time frame that we see agriculture come for the first time. And so at first, I think the people who lived in Europe kind of kept, again, that same hunter-gatherer lifestyle, so living off the land, basically. But then people started to trickle into Europe from other places where they'd already started to settle down and domesticate animals and starting to actually grow crops. And as they moved into these areas, they showed the local people how to do that too, and then they all started doing it. So it was actually a pretty major change that took place at the end of the Ice Age, and it was almost like the end of a very long era, because up until that point, people had always lived in little groups and been more mobile and moved around the landscape, and suddenly, for the very first time, they started to settle down more, and they started to rely on growing food as opposed to going and looking for it. So yeah, interesting time. So good questions to all of you. Now, I just wanted to quickly look at some of the classes, the grade 4s and the grade 5s both had some ideas about what some of the signs might mean. So I just wanted to quickly address those too. So number one, asterisks. Quite a few of the students thought it could represent a star, and some thought it could be used to emphasize important information. Okay, first of all, yes, asterisks nowadays are certainly used to emphasize important information, and we don't know what any of the signs mean, so maybe they were some sort of almost like exclamation mark or pay more attention here. But it is also equally possible they could have represented something out of the sky, whether that was the sun or a star or some other celestial body. We don't know, but certainly in other ancient cultures that started to use writing later on, so things like cuneiform, so that's out of Sumerian Babylonia, so that part down in the Middle East there. They used an asterisk, and yes, they did think it was a star. So it is always a possibility, but of course we don't know. So this is all speculative, but it is fun to try and imagine, isn't it? Um, and then one that some of the students wondered about was whether aviforms could represent the shoulders and neck of a human. I've never actually heard that before. It's a really interesting idea, especially because in other cultures where they do rock art, where we know more about what the art means, sometimes, yeah, they did use partial outlines to represent people. So, yeah, it's a really good suggestion. Again, we don't know, but yeah, really, it's a good one. So, well done, you guys. Circles. Lots of people had ideas about circles, that they could be rocks or represent a human head. They could be something precious or part of maps or crop circles. Haha. So with circles, yeah, we don't really know what they could have meant. It could be the moon too, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, they could have been representing something on the landscape. They could, again, a human head is round. So, and it, keep in mind too that we're talking about 30,000 years of prehistory here. So honestly, a lot of the signs probably had different meanings in different times and different places, and they probably didn't stay completely the same over time either. So I think we have to remember that it's entirely possible that we could have more than one right answer to something. And that really comes to play here when we're talking about dots, which we got some great ideas. Some students thought it was snow or stars or berries or land, or could stand for constellations. In response to that, it's possible that all of them are right. I think dots in particular are one of the signs where we find them in lots of different places, and we find them used in different ways. So in some places, they almost are like lined up as though they could be counting something or outlining or something like that. And then other places, yeah, they look like they're in clouds, or maybe they could be a constellation. I know in a cave called Lascaux in France that some researchers have proposed that one set of 7 dots and another set that's kind of in a line, one of them could represent a set of 7 stars called the Pleiades, and that the other ones in a row could represent Orion's belt. So it is certainly possible that some of them in that context could represent stars or constellations. Snow is an interesting one because, of course, snow would have been everywhere in their world, and we don't really know how they would have represented snow. But dots is as good as anything, so it is certainly possible. That's a good guess. And then the other one I wanted to mention too is in some places, dots, caves that I've been in, you find dots often sort of near branches in the cave, or almost like maybe some sort of path marker, which again would be really logical to keep track of where you are in a cave, right? So it could also be that. Some of the students were also wondering about claviforms, and they were thinking it could be a torch or maybe a spear. Yeah, it's also, people have wondered, those are both good guesses. And what's interesting though is there's one cave I've been in called Cuyavera, where there's actually a row of 7 of, I think like 7 or 8 of them in one part, and then another set right over there. So there's 2 big rows of them. And again, we don't know what they mean. They were there actually with some dots, interestingly enough, and I think some lines. In a North American cave art site, so completely different time, different place. So again, we'd want to be really careful to try and draw lines there between the 2 sites. But somebody pointed out to me not that long ago that in those places they actually represent like the outlines of warriors. So that was kind of an interesting idea as well, as maybe they were meant to represent people, or sort of that silhouette. But other people have suggested that, yeah, maybe they represent some sort of club or spear, so some sort of weapon. And so, yeah, and a torch is an interesting one too, because of course they would have been bringing lots of torches into caves with them. So what else do we have here? We have the grade 5 specifically were wondering about the outlier sign at El Castillo. Yeah, I mean, it could be lots of things. So I like all your guesses of cracks in roads and arms and something they were imagining or planning to make. Other interpretations I've heard too are it could be a boat, was one thing I've heard. Yeah, it's a really complex, very interesting shape, isn't it? So it's a really, I wish we could just get inside their heads, hey, or if we had somebody to ask, it'd be so great. But yeah, I mean, I think there's probably, my personal thought is that more of the signs probably do represent real things than we've actually figured out up till this point. Some of them might be truly abstract, sort of mysterious symbols, but I think other ones could be sort of real world objects that we just haven't quite managed to figure out and kind of pin down yet. Which leads to the question of penniforms that a couple of students wanted to know about as well, where they were thinking they almost looked like trees, specifically kind of like pine trees. And yeah, it's a good guess. I mean, that's sort of been the question, is that you have all the animals, you have some humans, you've got these geometric signs, and it's like, well, where's everything else, right? Where's the landscape? Did nobody look up? So back to the asterisks. Yeah, there's a lot of things going on in the art that we still have to figure out. And again, there's not that many of us working on it, and we're working away. So hopefully stay tuned, and we'll have some more answers for you guys in the future. But maybe one or two of you will grow up to help us too. So, because there's always room for more of you. We got lots of work to be done. So thank you very much, St. Helens. I really appreciate your questions and your interest in my research, and hopefully that kind of answered some of it for you. Thank you. Goodbye.